One thing that I think we can't be remiss of is, and I think something that a lot of these protesters keep reminding us of, is that the story is Gaza. The story over and over again is Gaza. And I think as time has gone on, as more and more divestment votes have been passed, as there have been more instances of administrators refusing not only to accept those results, but even to engage with them. For example, a lot of these protests are launched because administrators just kind of ignore these demands. The more over and over this continues to happen, just the more this frustration has bubbled up. And I think the confluence here was the fact that this second hearing, this sort of sequel to the blockbuster hearing that happened, more over a month ago, with resulting in the Harvard and Penn presidents resigning, was of course this hearing featuring namely the Columbia administration, Columbia President Manoush Shafiq, some members of the Board of Trustees, a member of their task force on anti-Semitism. And at the same time that that was happening, these Columbia students decided to, of course, launch this encampment to really try to escalate the protests to some sort of level that was at least reminiscent of some of the protest action that we've seen at campuses like Columbia in the past. And they really committed to it. They got hundreds of students out there, timed to coincide with this hearing. And so at the same time that there's all this drama, all this media hype, especially from the New York, DC media around this hearing, what's going to happen? Is the Columbia administrators going to trip over the same, rakes that the Harvard and Penn presidents did? There's all this sort of abstract, almost out of touch to the actual suffering at hand intrigue with the hearing. And then at the same time, you have all of this frustration at campuses all across the country, but sort of hyper-focused within the Columbia sphere. And all that sort of coincided to that first moment. And then, of course, after that, after the hearing, on Thursday and the days after the hearing, when the Columbia administrators left that hearing, and they were kind of feeling this pressure from Congress to turn up the dial even more than they and other campuses already had to these anti-war protesters, they, of course, decide to acquiesce and escalate and authorize and call upon the New York Police Department to sweep the encampment, as we've seen from those images. And that really set it off, of course. That was kind of the spark that I think then incentivized a lot of other students from all over the country who had also, again, been feeling these frustrations too, to think, if these students are going to do it, it's time for us to as well. And you've seen over and over again, day by day, as one campus gets met with, just massive police repression, crackdowns, 5 or 10 more encampments pop up the next day.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Manoush Shafiq most recent congressional hearing, because it did seem like she did her homework and tried very hard not to step on the same rakes, as you put it, that the other college presidents had stepped on. But that in doing so, she also effectively threw students under the bus and did seem to basically instigate a much greater backlash than happened at any of those other colleges. So she made a deal with the devil, it seems, to acquiesce to the bad faith pressures of, I won't say just the Republicans in Congress, it was much broader than that, but certainly led by Elise Stefanik and the like.
We know that there were decapitations of babies, of innocent Israeli citizens, of seniors, of women. There were rapes, and yet Columbia hired this individual as a professor. How did that hiring process work? Were you aware of those statements before the hiring?
I share with you your repugnance at those remarks. I completely understand that. On my watch, faculty who make remarks that cross the line in terms of anti-Semitism, there will be consequences for them.
What are the consequences
I have
in this
five
case?
cases at the moment who have either been either taken out of the classroom or dismissed.
And is he one of those?
He will never work at Columbia again.
And as a consequence now, she's dealing with, not just on her campus, the huge amount of pushback, but that these encampments have spread like wildfire. I don't want to skip over the core demands that the students at Columbia and elsewhere are making. You alluded to the fact that there are these divestment campaigns, and that the reason why there was this escalation is in part because of how those campaigns have been ignored. Can you speak specifically into what kind of demands students are making?
Yeah. So at the very least, students across the country are asking for their administrators to provide more transparency into where their university endowments are invested into, namely, of course, with concerns of weapons contracting companies implicated in Israel's violence in Palestine, beyond just their war in Gaza. Um, Moreover, their big demand, of course, is divestment from those investments, not just awareness of them, but full divestment. In the same way that, of course, we've seen divestment campaigns before for fossil fuels for South Africa. This is not new. Moreover, there are a lot of schools that have various partnerships with either academic institutions or other institutions in Israel, whether it's sort of research collaborations with AI, or sort of dual degree programs, as Columbia has with Tel Aviv University. There's all sorts of programs that all sorts of schools have. And so a lot of these schools as well are calling for, boycotts or cutting off ties of those programs as well. So those are kind of the broad range of demands that a lot of these students are making. And, again, are ones that if one were to just be explained why students are demanding these in relation to, of course, Israel's ongoing treatment of Palestinians for decades, but as well with regards to their ongoing war in Gaza for the past 6 months, many people would see this as, whether they agree or disagree, they would understand the sort of the energy behind these protests. So it's, of course, we'll get into this more, but it's, of course, just been very remarkable, particularly over the past week, to see how members of Congress have totally reframed, to say the least, what these protesters are asking for and what they have been asking for years. This is, again, not new.
So let's talk about this reframing, because last week there were, I think it was all Republicans, all New York Republican representatives and Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, all descended on Columbia's campus to give a speech, which was met with boos and jeers from the audience, but which didn't, I think, anticipate a positive response. It was a kind of performative pageantry to demonstrate to a broader right-leaning audience, or is a pro-Zionist audience, that these representatives were clearly standing against the students.
A growing number of students have chanted in support of terrorists. They have chased down Jewish students. They have mocked them and reviled them. They have shouted racial epithets. They have screamed at those who bear the Star of David. Enjoy your free speech.
And that has come along with a number of statements from other elected officials, whether it be Tom Cotton, who has now for well over a week been making statements that incite, like quite literally approve of violence directed at protesters. Whether it was a statement about how if protesters block traffic and glue their hands to a car, then they should have their skin ripped off their hand, they should be thrown over the bridge, statements like that. Or Governor Greg Abbott in Texas, who has openly backed the use of police force and state violence to suppress the protests. Catch us up on kind of how much this has really escalated, because you really can't overstate it. This is obviously a podcast, not a visual medium primarily, but the imagery that we've seen across the country, it's gone from having a conversation about, okay, USC bans their valedictorian from giving remarks, not because they know anything about what she's going to say, but presumably because she is Muslim, there is this presumption that she's going to say something about Palestine to make parents uncomfortable at graduation. And that has now escalated into canceling the graduation altogether because of protests against the action of suppressing the literal speech of this valedictorian who's worked hard for 4 years to get into a position where she was granted that honor. What's been going on?
So, of course, there's just the basic issue at hand of the litany of ways you could go to any number of these members of Congress, both on the right and left, particularly, of course, like the center left, on their stances on free speech. Of course, this is a mask-off moment for that, as far as where free speech does and does not matter to them. But that's just sort of the baseline. I think more broadly, to your point, it's just been so remarkable to see sort of the cogs of American power, both in terms of American institutions as educational institutions, but also, of course, the elected officials overseeing and pressuring those institutions. Rather than allow students to have a graduation ceremony, rather than allow students and faculty to protest, to have their anti-war views, rather than allow them to criticize a government that we send billions of dollars to that is killing people on American taxpayers' dollars, and the moral stains that that provides to a lot of people. They're canceling graduations. They're putting snipers on roofs. They're arresting not only students but now faculty members. Parents are even getting in the fray, and it's to your point. The images are the kinds of things that, of course, the cliche of like, these will be in the history books. Well, they certainly will. Like, these are the kinds of things that are just almost absurd to look at. There was a student yesterday, I believe at Emory, a black student who was, probably wrongfully apprehended at the outset of just, being at the protest. But of course, upon apprehension, there's numerous officers on him. He's already, handcuffed, unarmed, and they're tasing him while he's on the ground. There's another image of it from a different college campus of this young woman who she might even still be 18 or 19, I'm not sure. She was wearing like pink Crocs, had no sort of object in her hand. She was just at the protest. And there were 3 officers on her, like dragging her to wherever I guess they were collecting arrested protesters. Just the kind of absurdist, violent images that you look back upon from 40, 50, 60 years ago thinking, man, what a chapter. Well, this is just another chapter. So yeah, it's been remarkable. It's been just so notable to see how many members of Congress, of course, particularly on the right, have been so eager to inspire, motivate this kind of police violence, given, of course, many of these members of Congress purport to care about free speech. They purport to care about responsible use of American taxpayer dollars, of not being sort of the policeman of America. They purport to care about the police state in America. All of those values are on complete sort of mask-off mode right now. None of these members clearly seem to genuinely care about any of those things when it comes to people protesting the war right now.
I mean, Greg Abbott in particular has been really hoisted by his own petard because he signed into law a bill that was supposed to specifically protect free speech on college campuses within the last couple of years. And people have been juxtaposing his kind of chest beating heroism as he signs this law as though he's standing up to power with his open calls for the power of the state to be used to suppress these protests on what are clearly ideological grounds. And we've seen this across the country, people pointing out that Manoush Shafiq at Columbia, when she was at LSE, one of the most kind of high-profile Charlottesville protesters was a student at LSE when she was there as well. No harm befell him. There was no expulsions. There was no censorship of any kind. People have pointed to numerous examples of openly white supremacist groups walking across college campuses, Proud Boys and the like. In fact, Gavin McGinnis, a Proud Boy member, was at Columbia at the end of last week, apparently with none of the violence directed at him as has been directed at these Columbia students who are allowed to be there, who pay tuition to be there, but who have found themselves in zip ties, hauled off to jail in the back of police cars. And I'm so glad you brought up what's been going on with some of these professors, because whether it's through signed letters, which many professors at these institutions have signed on to expressing solidarity and support as a matter of principle with the students, regardless, the right to protest, regardless of what your broader feelings are about, what their broader feelings are about Gaza, in addition to ones who have literally put their bodies on the line and have found themselves assaulted by the police for trying to intervene on behalf of their students when they see them being thrown to the ground and molested by officers of the law. There was one particularly compelling example of a female professor. I believe it was at at Emory. Her name is Caroline Folan. Can you describe what happened there, and if you know if there were any follow-ups to that incident?
Is that there's been so much to keep track of. Is that the
Yeah, I
philosophy
know.
professor?
I think that philosophy professor was even a different professor. She
Oh,
wasn't
dear.
thrown to, she was hauled off. She was wearing all
Yes.
black and was hauled
Yes.
off, and we should get to her as well. The Emory professor was one that was literally tackled to the ground and was shouting, I'm a professor.
Yes. Right. Yes.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Give me some cops! Let's see your head! My head! Hit that trooper's head! You just hit my head! On the concrete!
Oh my God! Oh my God! You people are fascists! You are Hitler! You are laughing dogs! Shame on you! May you never live another day!
I am a professor!
This is an Emory professor,
I
everyone!
am a professor of economics!
And so I believe as of today, just the recent update is that, well, I suppose today, I mean, whenever people hear this, the recent update as of this recording is that she, the administrators have, instructed the police to, release her, remove any charges. Some people say that, of course, it helped that, she was a tenured professor as well. One thing that was kind of sparking a discourse is this idea of her yelling, I'm a professor. And some people were kind of taking that to be sort of bad faith, like an interpretation that, of course, a white professor is kind of using, I don't know. It was this, silly discourse that I don't even want to get involved in. But I think,
of course, like she's trying to basically use her privilege. Like she was surprised that she would be treated the same way
as
her students.
Which I think it was the exact opposite of her to say that, clearly I'm of no harm. No one here is of harm. What are you people doing? I think was probably more of what she was going for. But regardless of that discourse, that is one of, dozens of examples at this point where you see professors physically putting themselves in harm's way, blocking sort of the police from charging upon students who are locked in arms. Maybe they're in the encampment. Maybe they're just sitting chanting. There's been numerous professors I've talked to that have just expressed, not just horror and disgust with their administrations, but just very straightforward statements of, you will not touch our students. You will not touch our students. And it's been remarkable to see, this as almost a microcosm of a broader sort of rift of sort of American prioritization of what are we funding? Police that are compelled by certain people in power to get rid of anything or anyone in the way. Because again, some of these officers might have their own scruples as well about these kinds of things. Or are we going to prioritize teachers and what they embody of sort of caring for young people, of being along their side, regardless of whether they fully agree with them on everything with regards to, for instance, Israel and Palestine. Teachers who will literally say, do not touch my students. I'm with my students. I'm here for them. That relationship is something that, is beautiful, something that hopefully many of your listeners and you and I have experienced. Are we going to support that kind of spirit in America, or one that's just much more impulsively, reactionarily punishing, one that clearly has no accountability? Because at the blink of an eye, within a week, these levers have turned so quickly in a way that is just shocking. That all of these these officers can be mobilized and ordered to do these things in a matter of days. Whereas, there's any number of social problems that apparently we can't solve at let alone a snaps rate, let alone at years rate, decades rate. And so I think for a lot of people, that in itself has been very revealing, and I think has brought even more people to this cause. I think that's another reason why more and more people are either becoming more curious about Israel and Palestine, about America's role in it, and in the short term, interested in these protests and maybe thinking that they as well might be sympathetic.
The UT Austin coverage in particular, with the phalanx of cops that look like stormtroopers marching in line across a public university campus, has been, I think that in some ways, it's hard to say this one was the worst and what the tipping point was, but so much of the discourse has been dominated by these bad faith arguments that what is going on, what these protesters are protesting is Jewish people existing, that the root of this is anti-Semitism. There have been a intentional conflation, particularly at Columbia and I think NYU, of the actions of outsiders who are literally outside the gates of the university, who have no affiliation whatsoever with the students or their cause, with what's going on inside, in an attempt to paint the student protesters, who have been incredibly disciplined in their message, incredibly nonviolent, incredibly interfaith, and incredibly inclusive, as holding beliefs that they absolutely don't have, but which have been expressed by a couple of outsiders who may or may not even be false flags themselves. Obviously, one of the big stories that right establishment media ran with, the New York Post to the Wall Street Journal, was of a young woman who claimed that she had been stabbed in the eye with a flagpole. Video evidence that later came out suggested that she had been, at best, brushed with a flag in a crowd before going on the cable news circuit talking about how she was trying on eye patches because she had been so seriously injured by this.
My peers I'm frightened by them, to be frank, and I should be, because I've been assaulted once, and I don't see why it shouldn't happen again, because it's being organized and encouraged and protected by the rallies themselves and by the rally organizers themselves. Again, when a student assaulted me by jabbing me in the eye, what happened afterwards was that the human blockade of protest organizers, of student leaders in these anti-Semitic rallies, that blockade stopped me from finding out who my assailant was. It's all about violence.
And that's the best they can come up with, because really, I just want to give kudos up the wazoo to these students who have been so compassionate and so disciplined and so inclusive in the way that they've been handling themselves in the face of this onslaught, that they are frankly next to unimpeachable as a moral standard. And then you alluded to the fact that in the face of that, in the face of students at Columbia holding a Passover Seder, in the face of students holding hands with each other and doing I saw some kids black kids doing a step dance, some South Asian kids doing some South Asian dancing, everybody just doing their thing. You get not just the stormtroopers moving in, but snipers on roofs. What do we know about those snipers so far?
Yeah, so that was an image that apparently came out of a university in Indiana, and it's still very early reports, but it was interesting that one person actually appeared to sort of climb up a stairwell in a building nearby adjacent and kind of take a closer video of what appeared to be the sniper on the roof, which was kind of like, well, seems like you shouldn't be stuck up on that easily, but that's
right.
Neither here nor there.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that is just kind of par of the course of just this, like, if you step back for even a moment and take a breath, half a breath, you think, how did this happen in a matter of days in response to, again, to your point, students who largely are very happy to be, of course, in very difficult, unfortunate, just painful circumstances, be together to be imagining a world in which how they're living within the encampment of just living freely in an interfaith, communal, caring way is one that could be part of, the real world that we live outside of this encampment. And it's just been shocking to see that sort of contradiction. I think to an earlier point of yours about sort of what we are responding to, I found a few specific moments interesting that kind of reveal the tensions of how these Republicans especially are responding. One in which is when, Speaker Mike Johnson and some of his fellow Republicans, Mike Lawler, Anthony D'Esposito, and Virginia Fox, who, of course, chairs the House committee that's been leading these anti-Semitism hearings, when they were at Columbia, which, as a sidebar, they descended upon the steps in main campus on Columbia, which seems to imply that they were given the platform explicitly by the university to speak there, which is interesting. I'm not saying that's for sure, but that seems to imply, given that they walked out of the main campus building and had this huge platform. But regardless, upon that press conference, Mike Johnson afterwards was asked, by, I believe, a wonderful WKCR reporter, that this is the Columbia radio station. He asked Mike Johnson, what's your message to the anti-Zionist Jews who are in the encampment, who have been, celebrating the holidays? And he said, I don't know who's in that camp. And then continued on with, whatever answer he had.
What is your message to the students inside the encampment right now?
My message to the students inside the encampment is go back to class and stop the nonsense. Look, if we want to have a debate on campus about the merits of these things, let's do that. But you can't intimidate your fellow students and make them stay home from class. Think about that. Is that right? Do you think that's right? Stop wasting your parents' money, Congressman Lawler says. I think that's right. Last one.
Anti-Zionist Jews inside the camp that are celebrating Shabbat.
I don't know who's in that camp over there, but I would tell you that this is unacceptable, and the American people are demanding accountability for it. And that's why we made the trip here today. That's why this press conference is important. We want this administration and the administration of every university campus around the country to bring this to account and to bring this lawlessness to an end. And that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Which is revealing, because if you are the House Republican leader and you went from DC to New York City on this special field trip of yours to ostensibly condemn this encampment of what you're purporting are anti-Semitic, terrorist, sympathizing, radical, fill in the blanks. And then you say, I don't know who's in that camp. I mean, that alone is a pretty interesting admission, because it very much reveals who you are and are not interested in speaking to, for one. And of course, that was around the same time that there were thousands of Jewish people in Brooklyn who were protesting, as they have been for months on end at this point, specifically in that spot, Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, New York. But of course, those Jewish people aren't being talked to. Another instance that I think kind of, revealed a lot was that, to your point, of course, there might be people here or there that might say things that are, quite awful. Of there are 8 billion people in this world. There are millions of people in this country. Some people have some pretty awful views. And of course, one of the main issues here is the fact that these largely interfaith, largely caring, compassionate, hopeful, furious in the fact that their hope isn't spreading enough type of protesters are, of course, being represented in the worst possible ways because of one person who might have said something, especially outside of campus, who might not even be a student.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.